So this is actually a kind of a pre-lesson. We need to define a few things before we go to the next lesson. So this is independent and dependent variables. You've probably talked about this in your science class. I can't remember the terms exactly that they use, but we use independent and dependent variables. So these are the definitions that I wrote down. You can pause the video and write them down if you need to, and then I will talk about them in just a second. All right, so independent variable. The way I remember it is independent is input, or independent, you have to remember, is the x. So independent we always use as the x. The dependent so independent variable is an input value of a problem or situation. Typically we use x to represent. Dependent, this one I'm always the best at figuring out the dependent because it depends on the other. And we'll talk about a few problems in just a minute, but the dependent variable depends on the other. And we use y to represent that. So if we were talking about distance and time, the time that you travel depends on how long you've been traveling. So that's the dependent, independent. So let's look at this problem. Again, same thing. If you need to, just as situation one, if you need to pause the video so that you can write this down, go ahead and write it down. And I'm going to slide it up just enough to see that bottom part. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start. So Peter coaches soccer camps and charges $15 per person. T stands for the total amount of money he makes, and P stands for the number of players. So the way I always think about it is I always want to set up a blank depends on blank. Because if I can figure that out, whatever depends on the other, this one would be the dependent, and this one would be the independent. So if I can figure out what depends on the other, then I can figure out which one's the dependent. So I'm going to actually use a Post-it and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. So I'm going to write the two variables down. So we have T is the total money, and then I'm going to write down P is for number of players. And I know you guys, if you see the way I wrote it, so you're going to think that that says P hashtag of players. That just is number. So in math, we use the hashtag as number of players. So, and the reason I wrote this on Post-its is so that I can move this. Does the total amount of money depend on players, or do the number of players depend on the total amount he makes? So I want you to think about that for a second. So is it number of players depends on the amount of money, or is it the other way? The total amount of money he makes depends on the number of players. Hopefully you realize that this is the correct statement, because however much money he makes depends on how many players. If he had one player, he would only make $15. If he had 5 players, it would be 15 times 5. So this amount of money that he makes depends on however many players he has. So I'm going to go ahead and write that. I know you guys probably don't have a Post-it, but I'm going to go ahead and write that. So T is the total amount he makes. Notice they told you what letter to use. So T equals the total amount. Sometimes you'll get a problem where it doesn't actually tell you the letters to use, and you have to decide what letters are necessary, or what letters do you want to use. Okay, so then T, total amount of money he makes, depends on P, number of players. Make sure you know that that says number, not hashtag of players. So number. Okay. The independent variable is the P, number of players. And the dependent, the one that depended on the other, is T, total amount. Okay, so here, let's go to another problem. So this is situation number 2. I'll leave it there for a second so you can pause so that you can write that down. I'm going to scoot it up just a little bit. So Tara uses her cell phone a lot and she gets charged $5 per gigabyte of data. C stands for the total she pays and N stands for the number of gigabytes she used. So again, we're going to write that statement of blank depends on blank. I'm going to get new post-its. So we have C. So notice I said what variable. So C stands for total she pays. Here, I'm going to move that one over there. And N is for number of gigabytes. I spelled that wrong, but that's okay. So again, we're going to see if this statement makes sense. Does the number of gigabytes depend on the total she paid, or is it the other way? The total she paid depends on the number of gigabytes. So think about that for a second. Is it this way, or is it the other way? N depends on the paid. So hopefully you said in your mind that the amount she pays depends on how many gigabytes used. So we're going to go ahead and write that. So C total she pays, and N number of gigabytes. Okay, so the total she pays depends on the number of gigabytes, and we can put the word used just so it makes more sense. So then from that statement, we know this one depends on the other, so I'm going to go ahead and write that one first. This is the dependent. C is the total she pays. N is the number of gigabytes used. Okay, now let's go to the next one. Situation number 3. We have a graph, we have number of games rented and total cost. And these numbers don't matter, I just threw a line on there so you can do the same. It does not have to be at certain points to match mine. Okay, so notice there are no variables used here. So think about a graph. We have the x and y axis. Well, which one is the x-axis? Well, that's actually this one down here. So this would be x, and this one up here is y. The way I remember which one's x and which one's y is I write my y with a straight down line, and I think about the y as the up and down line. Okay, so then we're going to have to go over here off to the side and say what x is. So x is the number of games rented. So if you went to, I can't even remember the name of that store where you can rent games and buy games. That's near like Hobby Lobby or that area. So if you have x equals number of games rented, so if you went in and wanted to rent however many games, then y is the total cost. Okay, So the independent and dependent, I'm not going to write it out this time, write our statement with using post-its, because if you look back at the definition, the independent variable is x, the dependent variable is y. So the way, and I'll show you this in just a second. So well, actually, I'll just show you on the back. Nope, sorry, I just changed my mind. So the way to remember this is if you think of dry mix. So dry mix, if you think about dry, dependent is the y variable, and then mix. So I'm pretty sure this is a science. It's manipulative, or I can't ever say that. But independent is the x. So dependent is y, independent is x. So if you just remember, and this is the responsive. So from science, manipulative, responsive variable. But the way to remember it is dry mix. So dry is dependent, y, which goes with y. Mix is independent, and x. So it's just one little trick. You don't have to remember that. I just heard that the other day and I thought it made sense. So independent is x, dependent is y. So which one? So we know already that this is the total cost, and this one is number of games. You can also check because the total number of games, or the total cost, depends on how many games you rented. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too bad. Hopefully that made sense. Let me know if it didn't.